I've received a visit from Her Excellency Ambassador Katrina Zelenko, the Ambassador Extraordinaire and Plenipotentiary for Ukraine to our country, Singapore. She said she might be able to join us online today. I have great sympathy personally what is happening in her country, and I share the statement of our government that what Russia has done is so clearly against the UN Charter and any understanding of international law. Our talk, however, is about the implications for Asia. And our mission as a think tank is to really, for this moment at least, put aside the very human concerns about the real lives and suffering in that country and try to think about some of the more strategic and economic matters. That's why I'm doubly glad the embassy helped us to find that connection to the most recent speech by the president of her country, Ukraine. So for those of you interested, concerned, as many of us are, at the situation on the ground in the country, please use that link or other sources of information that are coming out on the situation there. But if I may, given our remit and focus of this talk, I'll try to steer this conversation more about the implications for us in Asia. I'm delighted to have two, as Sarah said, very renowned speakers who are more than just renowned, friends, I'd say, over many years. Even when I disagree with them, I always learn from what they say. The rough mixture of balance between the two is that I will look to Bilahari on my right to talk much more about the political security issues here in Southeast Asia and Asia more generally. He has served as the Singapore ambassador to Russia. He has, of course, besides his Middle East portfolio, perhaps even more famously, talked very much about the role and policies of China, intentions of China. On my left is another friend who I've learned a great deal about in terms of the economic implications. I'm not an economist, but it's apparent to me that what is happening there is not just a humanitarian crisis, but will have severe economic impacts on trends that were already emerging in terms of the supply chain fragilities, the inflationary tendencies in some, but Manu will tell us much more. So with that, may I give the time over to the opening comments by each speaker. And I think we're taking Bilahari first. Is that correct?
Yes.
No. Yes.
Yeah.
Is that okay, Bilahari?
All right, anybody.
Thank you very much for doing this, Bilahari.
Okay. All right.
Yes, please.
Oh, thank you for inviting me, Simon. Hello, everybody. I'll get straight to the point. I think we have to start from the question of what Mr. Putin's objectives are. Now, I don't claim to be able to read Mr. Putin's mind, but I think whatever his goals may have been at the beginning of the war, they have surely changed by now. Even if he had intended to move beyond Ukraine, that is now not on the cards. He has his hands full in Ukraine. Ukrainian resistance and the international response, the sanctions and the condemnation, has been firmer and more widespread than Mr. Putin probably expected. And moving beyond Ukraine would entail a direct confrontation with NATO, and that is simply too dangerous. Mr. Putin understands this. His announcement of a higher nuclear alert was a signal that he understood this, and a signal to Europe and US that they should not intervene directly. And that signal came, I think, after he realized belatedly that Europe was responding, NATO was responding in a kind of in a way that he did not expect. Beyond that announcement of a higher nuclear alert, it does not seem that Russia did anything to change the readiness of Russian nuclear forces. In any case, the US has not changed its nuclear alert status. So it was, I think, just a signal. Nuclear deterrence will keep the peace between NATO and Russia, as it did during the Cold War, and contain the water with Ukraine. But tragically, the very harsh logic of nuclear deterrence means that the price of this peace will be Ukraine. The West will supply Ukraine with weapons, as it already has, and there will be more of that, I think. It will give it political and diplomatic support. It will impose sanctions. But the US has ruled out the use of American and NATO forces to defend Ukraine or implement a no-fly zone, as President Zelensky has pleaded for. And I think these are correct decisions. The war is obviously not going as well as Putin and his generals may have expected. But without external intervention, and I don't think there will be external intervention, the ultimate outcome is not in doubt. The Ukrainians are fighting heroically, but in the end, the sheer mass of the Russian offensive will overwhelm them. It won't be an easy victory for Russia, but a slow, blinding, and bloody war with heavy casualties on both sides. And the nature of the conflict, I think, has a bearing. How will the war end? Well, when the invasion began, there were two broad possibilities. What I call the Donbas solution, that means you put some puppet government in Kiev, or the Kiev solution, or the Crimea solution, you just annex the whole thing. But I think things have changed somewhat now. Having failed to achieve a quick victory, politically, Putin now needs a clear victory and a decisive victory. It's increasingly difficult for him to compromise without looking weak. And looking weak is an outcome he cannot accept. Putin's right to rule, his legitimacy, rests on the claim that he has restored Russia's strength and the world's respect for Russia's strength, or at least the perception of strength and respect. And that perception is lying in the wrecks of Ukrainian cities. Now that his war is proving more difficult than expected, and more crucially, doubts have been raised about the competence of his military, Putin's legitimacy to rule Russia is ultimately what is at stake for him in Ukraine. In other words, it's a larger issue than Ukraine, per se. And after the bitterness of such a bloody war, I don't know when it will end, maybe a month, maybe two, maybe more. It's also difficult to conceive of any quisling government in Kiev being able to rule without the direct support of Russian forces. So one way or another, even after the fighting stops, Ukraine will be under direct or indirect Russian occupation for the foreseeable future. And some sort of insurgency may well develop under Russian occupation. And Moscow cannot take Ukraine's stability for granted for quite some time to come. How long, I don't know, but it's not going to be a year or two. It's going to be much longer. And this will have four broad geopolitical consequences. First, Mr. Putin has succeeded, rather miraculously maybe, where all post-war American presidents have failed. In other words, he has got Europe to take its own defense seriously. Overnight, Germany doubled its defense budget, 100 billion euros. That's not a joke, huh? And perhaps more significantly, it has overcome its long-standing taboo on transfers of weapons. And even neutral Switzerland, with such a long history of neutrality, has joined sanctions. And this is a new factor in international relations that I think is of direct relevance to our region, because it comes at a time when Europe is taking a greater interest in the Indo-Pacific. Second, and more broadly, Putin has reinvigorated the idea of the West, which after the Cold War had loosened considerably and I think was in some danger of decomposing entirely. As long as Ukraine remains under Russian occupation, the West generally and Europe specifically will continue to cohere, even if some internal strains eventually appear. And this is a more robust West without illusions. You know, one of the most stupid things I ever heard a so-called statesman say was John Kerry criticizing the annexation of Crimea as 19th century behavior in the 21st century. Now, there are many, many reasons to criticize the annexation of Crimea, but that was not among them, because that particular criticism assumed that your adversary shares your values. But if it shares your values, it won't be your adversary. And this is not just, this disillusionment would not be just about Russia, but I think more general, there was already a more realistic attitude in Europe emerging towards China, and I think this will be reinforced. Thirdly, Ukraine has underscored the importance of regional balances and the vital role of the US in such regional balances. Now, in Asia, anxieties about China have made countries in this region more aware of this strategic reality than in other regions, although not every Asian country was prepared to say so openly. This strategic reality is now evident in the Middle East and Europe as well. And no matter what reservations you may have about the US, and most countries have some, nobody has any strategic alternative to the US, because without the US, there is no balance against Russia or China. I'm not saying the US will be the only component, but it is the irreplaceable component. And fourthly, and most importantly, perhaps for the purpose of today's discussion, Russia's invasion and China's refusal to express disapproval of it will further complicate US-China relations and sharpen the line between them. Now, some very superficial analysts have tried to propagate the idea that the West generally and the US specifically will be so distracted by Ukraine as to give China a free hand in Asia, as happened during the Iraq and Afghanistan war. But this is really a shallow view, because the US has already made clear its forces will not get directly involved in the Ukraine. Europe is at last beginning to pull its own weight, its own defense. Of course, the US is going to backstop European efforts, but this time it is China's partner Russia and not its rival US that is at war and distracted. And war in the Ukraine has confronted China with three mutually irreconcilable objectives and placed Beijing in a dilemma. First, China wants to preserve respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and non-interference as key norms of international relations. And I think we all know it's neuralgic about these three norms. And the reasons for this are straightforward, and they can be summarized in three words: Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, particularly the last. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was obviously a direct challenge to these norms. Second, however, China wants to preserve its partnership with Russia because Beijing has no other partner anywhere in the world with Russia strategically. Think about it. Who are China's partners? North Korea, well, I've been there several times, and we hear the North Koreans talk about the Chinese. You wonder whether they distrust the Americans more or the Chinese more. And I think the answer is the Chinese more, because it's closer and it's a longer history. Who else does China have? Laos, Cambodia, Pakistan. Pakistan is as much a liability and a drain on Chinese resources as it is a strategic asset. So they're stuck with Russia, whatever reservations they have. And Beijing and Moscow also share a common discomfort with a Western-oriented global order. China only recently mustered the inner resources to call what was happening in Ukraine a war. It still has not used the word invasion, and I do not think China will ever criticize the war in Ukraine. Beijing hopes to play some role in brokering a ceasefire or settlement. At least it has given France and Germany some hope that it might do so. But I think if it wants such a role, it is a tactical role to get itself out of the pickle it's landed in, because China is not and cannot be a neutral party. We can talk about this more later. But at the same time, while China and Russia share this discomfort with a Western order, or a Western-shaped order, the fact is China is much more integrated into that order and has benefited much more from that order than Russia. It's become very common to call US-China competition a new Cold War. But I think this is a very intellectually lazy trope that fundamentally misrepresents the nature of that competition. The US and the Soviet Union led two separate systems that were connected only tangentially. But China and the US are both core components of a single global system, connected to each other with supply chains of a density of a complexity never before seen. And while there is some bifurcation, and there will be more bifurcation, particularly in domains with security implications, I think the entire separation into two different systems is highly improbable. So their competition is within a system. And that is, I think, a fundamentally different type of competition, far more complicated, non-binary, for a start, than competition between systems. Now, at a time when China's growth is already slowing for a variety of other reasons, and with the 20th Party Congress scheduled for this autumn, the disruptions that a major war in the heart of Europe are going to cause to the global economy that is still quite fragilely recovering from the pandemic recession, it's not something that Beijing would welcome. And the ongoing Liang Hui, the watchword of it was stability. What has happened in Ukraine is the antithesis of stability. The third Chinese objective, bearing in mind these economic interests, is to try and stabilize its relations with Europe as much as possible, and if possible, with the US as well, and more immediately and more crucially, to avoid becoming collateral damage in the sanctions that are being leveled against Russia. And this will be very difficult. Chinese netizens, as I gather from many sources, are still cheering Russia on. Apparently, there are some counter voices, but these are quickly drowned out and taken off the net. And being subjected to sanctions of such unprecedented scope, Russia has nowhere else to turn except China. And whatever its reservations, I doubt that Chinese leaders can entirely spurn Russia without exposing the hollowness of the so-called no limits partnership and raising inconvenient questions among its own people. Of course, Russia will become even more dependent on China, but this will be as much or perhaps even more a liability than an asset. In other words, Putin miscalculated and China followed him down a strategic dead end with no easy exit. There's no neat or easy way for Beijing to reconcile these three objectives. And balancing these objectives will be a distraction and a serious complication for China in its competition with the US. China is now walking a fine and precarious line. I don't think the US and Europe will cut China any slack in implementing sanctions against Russia. Chinese corporations and companies will have to balance the cost of compliance with these sanctions against the cost of defying them. And I think the equation comes out very obvious. China is Russia's largest trading partner. But Western markets are far more important to China than Russia and will remain so for the foreseeable future. Because China's efforts to become more self-reliant in key technologies or to rely more on domestic household consumption to drive growth will not show significant results for a long time, if ever. In other words, and this is important for us, China's economic relations with every country will be closely scrutinized on two counts: on account of the US competition and on account of the Russia sanctions. And this is going to make life more complicated for all of us. Few words about Taiwan and I'll shut up. The argument has been made that China will take advantage of US distraction of Ukraine to attack Taiwan or be encouraged to attack Taiwan. And I think this is just silly. First of all, I don't think the US is all that distracted. And there is certainly a strong bipartisan consensus on competition with China in the US and growing sympathy and support for Taiwan. Now, the US is not obliged to defend Taiwan, just it was not obliged to defend Ukraine. But the strategic and economic context of the two situations are entirely different. And Taiwan is clearly much more important. Taiwan is more important in the world economy. Taiwan is important as a crucial node in the global supply chains of semiconductors. And more crucially, from a strategic point of view, failure to defend Taiwan will loosen and ultimately dissolve US alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Conversely, if the US responds robustly and kinetically to an unprovoked attack on Taiwan. Now, if Taiwan unilaterally declares independence and provokes China, that's another scenario. But if there is if an unprovoked attack, I find it very difficult to see these alliances staying out, particularly Japan. And I think Beijing understands these fundamental differences between Ukraine and Taiwan. Chinese leaders are not going to confuse the two issues. And what lessons will they take from what's happening in Ukraine? First of all, a more resolute West that has responded with unprecedented sanctions must be something Chinese leaders are thinking about very closely. Second, I think if I was a Chinese leader, I'll be now thinking long and hard about what my PLA generals have been telling me. Because Chinese weapon systems are Russian systems modified. And while their doctrines, their military doctrines are not identical, they're very similar. And more crucially, the Russian army has been at war in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, in eastern Ukraine, whereas the PLA has not fought a war since 1979 against Vietnam. And while they overwhelmed Vietnam with their sheer weight, they did not perform in a stellar way, shall we say. So, and a cross-border land invasion is relatively straightforward, just relatively. I'm not saying it's easy. Yeah? An amphibious operation of the kind needed to take Taiwan is the most complicated type of military operation. Anybody who has served in the army at any level will tell you that amphibious operations are very complicated to do. And this will have to be a very large-scale one. Right? Probably on the scale of the Incheon landings, at least, if not larger. And China has absolutely zero experience in amphibious operations, except on a tiny little scale when they took over some islands in the Paracel after the end of the Vietnam War. And that was really hardly, that was against demoralized South Vietnamese soldiers and so on. So if I was sitting in Beijing, I would be thinking long and hard of this thing. Now, they will never give up their objective of reunification. But I think there is a new factor here. I don't think time is on China's side as far as the reunification of Taiwan is concerned. Because the Taiwanese identity is growing stronger. And at the same time, unlike his predecessors, Deng Xiaoping and others who wisely, I think, said reunification is a problem for future generations. Mr. Xi has at least implicitly, but quite clearly, I think, placed a time frame on it. The 100th anniversary of the PRC's foundation, which is 2049. That's not tomorrow, but it's not that far away again. One can only hope that Mr. Xi will not be in power there and is maybe perhaps safely dead, so his successors will feel no pressure to have to fulfill that implicit timeline. I'll stop here.
Oh, thank you very much, Bilahari. That's very insightful. While you have spoken about and written about the issues, I think putting them together this way, EU and also Russia, is very helpful for looking at the broader questions. You touched a little bit on the economy, but I hope that our next speaker will look at this more specifically. Of course, Manu does know his security and other political issues, and we're happy to hear from you for that too. Manu, would you take over?
Thank you, Simon, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and Bilahari, and also to be in person and to see and catch up with so many old friends. So I will restrict my views to the economy, and I'll split it into looking at the near term and then looking at some of the longer term secular changes that will come about as a result of this, I think, very big event. In the near term, I don't want to sound too optimistic, but I also feel that we shouldn't be carried away. This is definitely a negative development. It will slow the pace of recovery and it introduces new risks. But having said that, I think the key point I want to make is that there are multiple forces at work on the global economy. Ukraine is only one of them. Clearly, the Ukraine crisis will slow growth. If energy costs go up for businesses, they will obviously feel the pain, margins will come down, and they may downscale production, hiring, and so on, and that slows the economy. There is a diversion of income away from net energy importers to net energy exporters, and the way the world works, net energy exporters don't spend as much as net energy importers. That's just the way it is. Therefore, on average, demand comes down, global economy slows. So that's the bad news. In addition, of course, we've had significant increases, not just in energy costs, but also in the price of food. And that will clearly raise inflation eat into living standards, and that could also slow the economy. In addition, it puts central banks in our region and everywhere else in a quandary. You have the slowing effect of the crisis, but you've got higher inflation. And much as some people might say that something wrong with this, it keeps
No, just
saying,
the one.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, some people might say that it's not too much of a problem. I think central banks will have to take it seriously. Some people argue that a rise in energy and food prices is one-off. It is not core inflation. You don't need to move. But I think the way inflation has moved today, expectations have increased of even higher inflation. Central banks will have to manage these expectations down. Otherwise, inflation becomes self-fulfilling. So there is no doubt in my mind that our central banks in this region, global central banks, will have to tighten monetary policy. That will have some degree of a slowdown effect as well. So these are the negatives, and again, not to downplay them, but there are other forces at work. And the main one that we need to take account of, which I think offsets to a large extent the slowdown effect, is the pandemic easing. I think, of course, the pandemic has surprised us negatively many, many times, but I really do believe that the negative impact of the pandemic on the economy, I think, is now clearly dissipating. Even if you have new variants or whatever, the fact is at high levels of vaccination, improved medical treatment regimens, and governments clearly determined to move beyond the pandemic, and therefore not likely to impose severe lockdowns, even if there's another surge of infections. I think put that all together, and I think the impact of the pandemic eases. Now, what does that mean? It means significant release of pent-up demand. Consumers are sitting on excess savings everywhere in the world. In the US, it amounts to about $2.6 trillion. That pile of savings will be wound down, and that will help to keep demand and activity up. One of the elements of pent-up demand, I believe, is cross-border travel. I think people have a strong desire. Certainly I do. I miss my travel, and I'm going to start traveling as soon as I can once these things settle down. I see a very strong snapback in tourism across the world. So that's one set of positives which will help keep the economy moving. The other one is China. China has, as Bilahari referred to, been in a slowdown since last year, and it has been quite a concerning slowdown. All the more so because it looked like the Chinese authorities didn't want to respond as vigorously with stimulus as before, despite what seemed to us clear evidence of not just a slowing economy, but of growing imbalances in the economy, which, if triggered, could actually produce a very sharp slowdown. So the speech by Prime Minister Li Keqiang, I think, on Saturday was very important, because the signal now is, I think, quite clear. They will do what is necessary to protect the economy and to boost it. A lot of that is going to be through fiscal spending, but a lot of it is also going to be enacted through state banks, extending more loans to small businesses and the like. I think it's very serious. I think the plans announced by the Prime Minister and supplemented by other plans issued by the NDRC and so on probably do not go far enough. And I think there will be a further step up in easing policies by China over the next few weeks. And I think that is very important, because China is 18% of world GDP. It's about 10 or 11% of world import demand. It matters more than even a few years ago. And if China eases and the outcome is better than we had originally expected, then that is good for global growth and global demand. It's also good for things like commodity prices that are important to our part of the world. So the net impact on the global economy, yes, okay, putting the positives and the negatives together, certainly there will be slower growth than we had originally forecast for the global economy as a whole. That's inevitable given the energy price shock, and also the geopolitical shock, the sanctions and so on. But there's not going to be a global recession, and there's still going to be reasonably good growth across the world overall. Inflation, I think in terms of headline inflation numbers, clearly it's going to spike up in the first half of this year. But I'm equally quite confident that by the end of this year, year-on-year rates of inflation, say, December 2022 inflation compared to December 2021 inflation, will show a marked slowdown. So inflation is a problem, but it is something that with the right policies, as well as the natural reaction of prices to demand destruction and so on, there will be an adjustment down. Monetary policy, the Fed, I think, will continue to tighten, and that's something that's important to our part of the world, and that does bring some risks as well. I think there are two risks that I'm concerned about. Okay. One is that given the kind of very excessive, wild gyrations in asset prices, commodities, and some currencies, there is the possibility that large hedge funds that entered into risky structured products, derivatives, whatever, blow up. And that then ripples through the financial system into the real economy. That is an unquantifiable risk, but we have seen this happen before, so we cannot ignore that. That is possible, but it's very hard to predict, right? And usually you only find out about this after the event, right? The second concern I have is a good part of the more positive view I had on global economic growth was contingent on capital spending by large businesses across the developed world recovering. I still feel that this recovery will come through and it will be strong, but I suspect for the first 1 or 2 quarters of this year, large businesses, small businesses, any kind of business will probably downscale, defer decisions on big bets on new capacity and so on. So that is something I'm concerned about, and we should look at that very carefully. However, do remember that that is going to be offset by the increased defense spending. I'm not going to be cynical about this. Of course, we'd rather not have defense spending increase, but that's the reality. Now, I mentioned that because defense spending these days contains a lot of spending on info tech equipment. It is electronics rich. Our region specializes in the manufacture of electronics components. So in a funny sort of way, defense spending increasing is actually beneficial for the infotech industry, which is so prominent in this part of the world, in East Asia as well as Singapore, Malaysia. So what is the net impact on Southeast Asia? I think there will be a slower pace of recovery. I'm actually in the process of looking at my forecast, and honestly, I'm not making very significant downgrades to the forecast we had for our economies. We had very conservative forecasts, but we're not downgrading too much. We're shaving forecasts rather than significantly cutting them. And that's because I think the easing of the pandemic is going to be very powerful. Don't forget that tourism is a huge part of some of our economies, and that will, I think, come through. I mean, look at how Thailand, even as it suffers high Omicron wave infections, it has continued to open up the border and encourage tourism. Of course, Chinese tourism are not going to come back to Thailand for a long time because of the Chinese policies, and Russian tourists are going to disappear. But I'm pretty confident that in tourists from the rest of Asia, from India in particular, Europe and Australia will come back to Thailand, and the same thing will happen in Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. So the tourism recovery is going to be very significant. In Thailand, tourism directly, indirectly accounts for about 18-19% of GDP. So it's a big thing, right? But overall, the fact is, as the pandemic eases, you're going to get fewer restrictions on activity, fewer dislocations in supply chains. You're going to see labor importing economies like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand now start receiving foreign workers again. So the labor constrained sectors will start operating again. That's growth, right? Don't forget also that it's not just oil prices that have risen, but palm oil prices have also gone up. That is going to be very positive for the rural sectors in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and so on, in Vietnam, right? So there is some positive impact for rural spending and so on. I think the negative will come from maybe foreign direct investment not picking up as strongly as I had hoped for in the region. Clearly, if global businesses become more conservative, more careful, they're going to be waiting a while before they make these big commitments. Inflation will go up. And so the key question is how credibly and effectively central banks in our region respond. I think we're going to see a significantly accelerated pace of monetary tightening starting in the second half. I don't think central banks are going to rush into tightening policy right now, except maybe Singapore, but we have a different set of issues in Singapore. So I think it would be appropriate for the MAS to tighten policy in April at one of its scheduled meetings. What about the longer term? Am I okay with time?
A bit short.
Okay, very quickly. I see big structural changes. I think China will accelerate its efforts to decouple, to reduce its reliance on, first, on international demand, second, on the US-dominated financial system, right? And I think they are probably, as Bilahari said, horrified by the strength of the Western response. And that clearly is something that is going to, they're not just going to worry about it, they're going to do something about it, right?
And improve their economy.
Exactly, exactly. So that may mean doubling up on domestic demand and accelerating the shift away from exposure to US dollars in their reserves and so on. But I think the Chinese have some really difficult decisions. I mean, I think the point Bilahari made on dilemma in terms of geostrategy, but even in terms of economic policy, they've been very hesitant to make some big moves like hukou reform, right? Reforming the system that controls migrant workers and how much they're paid and so on. If they want to boost domestic demand, they have to really move much more aggressively on those areas that they've been hesitant about. So I think China has some very difficult decisions to make. I fear that the US is also going to continue turning inward. And I think supply chain reconfiguration will therefore be stepped up. To some extent, that might benefit Southeast Asia, to the extent that there are companies that want to move production out of China and not necessarily back to the home country or to a country like Mexico or Turkey or Morocco, which is on the border of a rich country. Right? So there might be some positives for us, and I suspect that there will be more companies moving production to Southeast Asia. So that's great. Finally, I think Southeast Asia will have to navigate through this minefield. Global trade will be slower. There'll be more protectionism, I suspect, against China principally, but I think that will spill over into us indirectly. We don't like a situation where there are more inward-looking policies because they distort trade and dampen export growth, but we'll have to live with that. I also think that China, Japan, and the US will compete harder for influence in Southeast Asia, and there might be some benefits for us in terms of, trade agreements that give us more market access, more Belt and Road type project aid, and so on. So that might be some positive. So finally, to conclude, I think we are in a much riskier and rougher world. I think smaller countries will be severely challenged, both by the political issues that Bilahari raised, as well as the longer-term structural issues that I raised. And a more bifurcated world is not a very comfortable world for us. Southeast Asia might be relatively better off than other emerging market regions, but only if its leaders are willing to make the right policy decisions, not just the central bank, but also the national planning agencies and so on. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manu, and thank you again, Bilahari. Let me go into the questions, comments. There is one on the screen about Japan. If I could wrap it into a bigger question, especially for Bilahari, is that you focused on, of course, major moving part, Russia. You can do a good reading of that. China, but how about the other players? So this question is about, well, Japan's talk about going nuclear or doing something on its own, as manufacturing more arms itself. Will that go ahead? India's dilemma, depending so much on Russia armaments, but yet increasingly seeing that the chief competition is from China and watching the China-Russia relationship going up. Taiwan, I think I agree with you. I very much agree with you that China would be foolish, and they're not that foolish, to think that this is an invitation to take Taiwan. But does Taiwan think this is a good excuse to play victim? And they, of course, have joined in the sanctions against Russia in a big way, playing it up. And to their credit, Russia now called them a country. So I don't know.
I don't think that makes Chinese very happy. But
on this side, I want to agree with you, Manu. I think that the positives could outweigh the negatives. But can you tell me the bounds of the negative? I think Bilahari, in a way, paved the path for you. He doesn't see it going beyond Ukraine. But could a whole of Ukraine approach, that long drawn-out misery, bloody, grinding war, change that negative to a slightly larger negative? Could the long-term disruption not just from the Russian economy, perhaps not doing well, but perhaps potentially imploding with the sanctions, could that change that the relatively small negatives you've talked about? If I could start with those questions and wait for others to arrive. Bilahari, would you go first?
Well, you all know what Mr. Abe recently said. He's out of office, but he's still a very influential politician. He said that Japan should consider allowing the US to station tactical nuclear weapons on itself. But I have long been of the opinion that it is only a question of when, not whether, Japan and South Korea get independent nuclear deterrence. Japan has been preparing for this for ages, with acquiescence of the United States, mind you, because the US-Japan Nuclear Cooperation Agreement is unique in that it is the only one that allows Japan to reprocess nuclear material. There's only one reason why you want to reprocess nuclear material, And in fact, they don't need to reprocess because they have quite large stocks of plutonium. In South Korea, the debate over this is an open debate. And even in Australia, the proponent of surrender before the war starts, Mr. Hugh White, has now changed his tune and has written a whole book advocating Australia think about having an independent nuclear deterrent. And this is all nothing to do with Ukraine. Ukraine can accelerate these things because I said it shows the importance of regional balances. It has been driven by, first, in the most immediate sense, North Korea, because that's not going to be reversed. But more significantly, China is improving its second strike capability. And it should. There's nothing sinister about this. If you're a nuclear power, it would be irresponsible not to improve your second strike capability, because that is what stabilizes nuclear balances, right? But once it improves beyond a certain point, and please don't ask me what that point is, because that's all subjective. The question will be asked, as it was asked in Europe ages ago, will New York or San Francisco be sacrificed to save Tokyo or Seoul? And the answer is obviously not. And you can't deter the nuclear power with conventional means. So I think it's a matter of time. And I don't think it's a bad thing, by the way, because the process of getting where we are to where I think we will end up will be very fraught. Right? So once you get there, it's a stabilizing factor. Right? India, I just came here from another thing, and I was asked. In fact, it was not asked; it was a comment masquerading as a question, as often happens, right? About there were great disappointment with India. Why did they abstain? Why doesn't it take a stronger stand? I said, it's because of your illusions, not India's. Right? Some analysts and some countries place far too much emphasis on the role of values. Values are not unimportant, but when push comes to shove, it's interest. India has enormous stocks of Russian weapon systems, which it needs to keep operational because of China on one hand, and China's partner, Pakistan on the other. And where is he going to get these spare parts and to keep it operational? You could get them from China in theory, but that's ridiculous, isn't it? Because your threat is from China, you can't be buying things. So I think it's perfectly logical. The same logic applies to Vietnam. And so I don't see anything particularly unusual about that. If people are disappointed, the disappointment is in their own mind. Taiwan, you raise an interesting question. There are always two sides of the thing. I said just now that I think an unprovoked attack on Taiwan will draw a very strong international response and probably a kinetic one from and I think the Chinese know. But there's the other side of the equation, which is the Taiwanese side. I think I reveal no state secrets because ministers have talked about it. At the end of the 1980s, we were just after Taiwan joined APEC. We were extremely confident that we could get Taiwan into some of the functional UN organizations. WHO, ICAO, the sum. I mean, the wrangling over the nomenclature is another issue, but I think we could fix that, right? Then came a gentleman by the name of Lee Teng-hui and screwed it all up. And Lee Teng-hui was followed by a friend, Ben, and made it worse. And now I think that's off the table. So Taiwanese domestic politics is a factor. I think Simon has head on her shoulders, a very level head. But who knows after her? And, this is not an issue that's going to go away. It has to be managed for a very long time, if not hopefully forever. Okay. So that is one factor, which is a big X factor because nobody knows how Taiwanese politics is going to evolve, except that you're not going to get anything like the old Kuomintang that at least had an ideal in common with the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think a new Kuomintang is at best blue-green, not blue and green. Okay? Because anything else is electoral suicide.
The bounds of the negative scenario. Yeah.
Okay. My assumptions were actually in line with what Bilahari said. I expected a fairly swift Russian victory, but with a continued insurgency, with the neighbors providing help, but very cautiously and being careful not to provoke the Russians too much. So now what can go wrong, right? What can go wrong is obviously on the political side if there is escalation somehow, wisdom does not prevail and things get out of control. Then obviously global business confidence, everything takes a hit, and you could get -2, -3% in Europe, and that translates into something quite bad globally. Right. The second thing where something could go very wrong is, as I said, if there is some kind of big financial debacle that is triggered by the wild swings in asset markets that we've seen now. Now that is, we've seen that happen before, but it happens very rarely. And if I had to put a probability on it, I'd still say quite a low probability, 10, 15% maybe, but not a huge one. I think those are the two.
What will happen with the removal of Russia from the SWIFT system? And there are possible scenarios of a true meltdown of the Russian economy, cutting it off and then having to rely on China.
Yeah.
As Bilahari said, then China faces knock-on the sanctions.
Yeah.
And then one question in the box is, would this cause some people to move out of US dollars into some sort of alternative? And we undermine.
Okay. Yeah. Can I take that last question first because it's the easiest one?
Yes.
If the Chinese, with so much incentive to move out of the dollars, could not do much, what more can you expect? Right? It is the fact of the matter is there is, whether you like it or not, there is no other financial market and system with the breadth and depth that the US dollar gives. The euro can't do it yet. So realistically, it's going to be very difficult. You can buy more gold, but that's about it. Not much option.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you are here on this rare occasion, hopefully more often in person. Is there somebody who wants to do the old-fashioned kind of question? What about Philip Wind over here? Is there a microphone? Or just speak up, Philip.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Hi, Philip Wind. I work for CPQ Infrastructure Fund. We all have been many of us have been surprised by this invasion. It seems unexpected, unforecasted, at least for many of us. Having said that, I'm sure it was planned and organized on the Russian side well ahead. So on top of, if for some reasons China is willing to reunify with Taiwan, on top of the domestic matters that you just mentioned, what could be the signal or the alert or that could potentially alert us that something is happening, so we are not caught by surprise the same way we have been with the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I don't think the prospects of a peaceful reunification are very good, because it's the issue of identity, which is a profound issue. Right? On the other hand, the Chinese will never give up the ideal of reunification. So the best you can hope for is, keep pushing this down into the future generations. But if they are planning an attack, there will be plenty of signals. You can't build up a force of that magnitude without giving out many signals. Modern surveillance technologies will pick this up. It's not something you can just launch without building up forces, massive forces, acquiring new capabilities, amphibious capabilities, and so on. So there'll be plenty of lead time. But I don't think it will happen. The most troublesome scenario is an accident that gets out of hand in the Taiwan Straits. Chinese pilot collides with or tries to make collide, two Chinese planes collide, pilot is killed. The public opinion in China swings.
So like Bush and China, but between China and Taiwan. When America and Bush, during Bush's time, had a collision.
No, that one was between America and things, so that can be contained. It was contained pretty fast. This is much worse, because the reaction, at least on the Chinese side, will be neuralgic. And then it's very simple to say, blame the Taiwanese government. But that's a small step to say, blame your own government for not being tough enough. And then blame the party, because who is the government but the party? So I think, this, and it all is, Taiwan kind of directly intersects with this very revanchist nationalist narrative that the Communist Party uses to legitimize itself. So it's very hard to disentangle. South China Sea, East China Sea, these things I think can be managed. It's kind of ridiculous to think of going to war over some tiny rocks here and there, but they will never give up either. But that's the thing. So I don't think we will be caught by surprise. Why we are caught by surprise is because people underestimated or discounted. It's this question of values. Again, to this thing about 19th century behavior in the 21st century. There was still after Crimea, there was an implicit assumption that that Putin's rationality is the same as mine because his values is the same as mine. It was much diluted after Crimea, but it was still there. Now I think that is dissipated.
Just to add to the point that Bilahari made about the knowledge, I think one of the US showed us is that using different intelligence sources and imaging,
you can get a good picture of what's
some of the Europeans didn't believe it, but it turned out that he
the problem is always this. In any kind of intelligence assessment, how to deduce intentions from capabilities. Capability is easy to see. It's there. You can't hide it. You can only hide it to a certain extent. But to leap from that to intention is another matter. All that build-up around Ukraine could have been intended to do another Donbass. It could be intended to intimidate. It could be intended to discombobulate the West. But everybody was wrong. The guy meant what he said.
I have a hand over here.
Yes, thank you. François, I'm from Banque de France in Singapore. You mentioned the sea change that is going on in Europe following this event. Obviously, this is major. You also mentioned the possible implication for what the Europeans are trying to do, which is a sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. What precisely could be how could it shape this Indo-strategic, European Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think, first of all, let's be realistic. I think what Europe's greater interest in the Indo-Pacific is quite natural because this is the most strategically important part of the world for a whole variety of reasons you all know. That said, Europe is always going to be in the third tier in this part of the world because you just don't have the capabilities, and when you develop your capabilities, they have to be deployed in your own theater. The most of them, right? But that doesn't mean it's useless. Because first of all, politically and diplomatically, it shows this is not just a US-China thing, it's a global issue for China, right? Putting out more flags has its own value, you know? So I don't see anything particularly surprising about this. What's happened in Ukraine may set back a little bit. I don't think it will derail Europe's Indo-Pacific aspirations, because obviously priority has to be given to your own neighborhood, right? But since the reasons that drove you in this direction, the strategic center of gravity shifting to this part of the world, not go away, you know, despite all the difficulties of China and all that, it will still be here. So after some pause necessary to build up your own capabilities in your own region, will come back, and the diplomatic and the political interests will not go away. Now, Russia, there is another thing that I think Europe was late to understand. About 50 years ago, after a huge mistake in Vietnam, the US moved from direct intervention to being an offshore balancer, and it has been remarkably consistent in that role. Because it realized that, you know, Vietnam was not this international communism as an existential threat, was all rubbish, old-fashioned nationalism, so on. Something similar is happening in the Middle East now because they made a mistake in Afghanistan. They have adjusted, and you know, is Iran an existential threat to the United States? No. Was Afghanistan an existential threat? Terrorism is a terribly dangerous thing, but it won't destroy any state. And something like that is going to happen in Europe sooner or later. Remember, Mr. Trump said, "What are all those American troops in Germany for?" It's not wrong. You know? I mean, he could have said it more elegantly, but you know, it's not wrong. You know, so I think sooner or later, and Ukraine delays the process a little bit, but it doesn't deflect the trajectory. So, you know, Europe wanted to be a global power on the cheap. And I've told European diplomats over and over again that, you know, soft power alone don't cut it. Because first of all, your values are not all that attractive. And your systems of governance is not all that attractive to everybody. Right? So what matters here is hard power. I remember when we were negotiating an FTA with the EU, there was a demand on one of our ministers by the EU Troika, and they were demanding parity of treatment for some particular domain with the US FTA. And our minister, it wasn't the foreign minister, told the Troika, we shocked them greatly. When you have a 7th fleet, you can have parity.
So it makes them more serious players, but you know, still in the third tier.
The first is US and China.
Yeah.
The second are the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia. You know, and
it closes the gap between the second and third.
Yeah, it does, and India. You know, it closes the gap a bit, right? And it's important politically and diplomatically because China always likes to say this is just America is interfering. You know, it's an interloper and all that, right? But now it is proven it is a global issue or issue of global concern. And that's valuable.
Good. Any other questions? If not, our time is reached. And sorry, one around the corner there. Charles?
My name is Charles from East West Group. I actually have 3 questions.
If you can squeeze them in quickly and they are somehow related, we can try.
My first 2 questions are directed at Mr. Bilahari. One is on Ukraine, the other one is on Russia. My third question is directed at Mr. Bhasksran.
Why don't you just go into the questions, please?
Okay, my question number 1 is, Ukraine has announced that they will not join NATO, and this will pacify Ukraine,
Russia.
So what I want to question now is that what is the model that they would have to be neutral?
First of all, it's too late. It's too late. I told you, Putin's, whatever his initial motivations, and I think they were revanchists and irredentists, and they are not. Okay, I happen to think that the expansion of NATO, indiscriminate expansion of NATO, was a mistake. And I've written so, right? But that's all water under the bridge. It's irrelevant. It neither justifies the invasion.
Exactly.
And now is, Mr. Zelensky said more or less the same thing a few days after the war started, when he said it's an aspiration. Now he's gone one step further, but the fighting continues. This is not the issue anymore.
So my point now is...
No. That's why I said there is no... I don't see that any good end.
Just when you go on to the next question.
I see.
There's
I
no
don't see
point
any good
arguing.
end.
You wanted to know his view, so he says that it doesn't matter
The
anymore.
second question is,
Yes.
If Putin must go, being a former ambassador to Russia, now who would likely to go?
He didn't say
Everyone knows.
Putin must go. He says that
Because
Putin was continue fighting.
You say Putin must go. More important, does Putin say Putin must go? I don't think
I
so,
think
The question will not be...
do you see any chance that there will be any sort of split in Russian
No,
society?
there is a split in Russian society, but not the split in the kind of Putin-centric structure,
Yes.
because they are all equally complicit,
Correct.
right? So I don't think they will split.
So short of another Russian revolution, this is not going to happen.
No, and I don't think that is going to happen either. Okay.
Okay.
So
Thank you. Now, my last question now is on Mr.
Manu.
Bhasksran.
Yeah.
Basically now is that you mentioned that Russian tourists will disappear because the Russians have fought so many wars. Present population, there are more women than men in Russia. My question now is, do you see that Singapore can have an economic package to marry, these Russian women and increase our baby population?
That's a very odd question, and I.
go down Orchard Towers, you see.
We are live on air, by the way.
Okay, never mind.
Bilahari, I'm not sure you're supposed to know the 4 towers halls.
I think
know
the
what-
solution to our demographic problem is different. I think it's to put a lot of effort into, infant care, child care, more paternity leave, encouraging our men to participate in baby care, that kind of thing. That's what will turn our demographics around. I don't think, turning to... The problem is not Russian lack of women. There are women.
I
The
like
problem is people don't want to have
live
children.
questions, because you never know what you're going to get. But can I use the last few minutes? Can I use the last few minutes of our time and attention to allow either speaker or both to give me anything that is still in their mind which they haven't had a chance to voice? Manu, would you like to go first?
Okay, just very quickly, this discussion about invasion of Taiwan. I've actually never believed that China wants to invade Taiwan. China would prefer to get Taiwan back through different means. Why risk a war? So emasculation, subversion, those are the things I think that we should look out for rather than an outright invasion. Outright invasion is held as an option to threaten, but I think the thing that will inform us practically is subversion, emasculation.
Well, I think you're right, because the West has shown a fairly muscular reaction. If the West had been very limp, and Russians had only taken Donbass, etc., you never know what the Chinese would have thought. But where we are, I think I agree with you. And Bilahari, last word.
Well, I think, the price, I think, generally speaking, the broad West, the political West, the strategic West, of which I think we are part too, although we will not admit it, right, is in a better strategic position today because illusions have been cast aside. There's more cohesion, but the price will be paid by Ukrainian blood. So,
well, thank you all very much for your attendance in real life. I hope you will join me. Thank you. Our two speakers, because really when we say live, we can't think of more lively discussion. I do want to come back to this very sobering thing that though we've enjoyed the intellectual discussion and even had some interesting questions, and responses, and I laughed a bit. I don't want to leave this topic without again acknowledging the truly deep human crisis that's going on. Bilahari said, and this is not the end. Bilahari said, bloody grinding war.
1 month, 2 months, 3 months, who knows?
Yeah, and then after that, continued instability into the 2-year horizon. I think that's something to worth thinking about, even when the headlines start to fit. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Bilahari. Thank you, Manu.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.